The slap landed before most of the room understood what they were looking at, and for one long second, nobody breathed. A woman in a charcoal dress stood at the center of the ballroom, with her cheek going pink under the chandeliers. And the older woman who had struck her was already drawing her hand back to her chest, as though it had acted on its own. The string trio near the windows had reached the gap between movements, so there was no music to soften it. There was only the sound of it, sharp and small, and then a silence that traveled outward across the parquet floor like a crack across a frozen lake. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody said her name, and not one of the 200 guests gathered that night at the Glenmara Lodge knew that the woman they were watching get humiliated was the only person on earth whose signature could decide whether a $1.2 billion deal closed in the morning or vanished before the snow stopped falling. 30 seconds later, she made a phone call that lasted less than a minute, and the family that had raised a hand to her began, without yet knowing it, to lose everything. It was the second Saturday of February, and the Rockies had given Banff the kind of weather that looked staged for a postcard. Snow fell in slow, unhurried flakes outside the tall windows of the lodge, settling on the spruce and on the roofs of the cars that valets in long coats kept ferrying up the drive. Inside, the Glenmara had been built a century earlier by a railway baron who wanted somewhere to entertain men he needed favors from, and it had never really stopped doing that job. The timber beams ran dark overhead. The fireplaces were the size of doorways. The whole place smelled of wood smoke and orchids, and the particular kind of perfume that costs more by the ounce than most people earn in a week. And the guests moving through it wore that smell the way they wore everything else, lightly, as if it had always belonged to them. This was a room where money introduced itself before people did, where the question was never what you did, but who your grandfather had been, and where new fortunes were tolerated the way a host tolerates weather. The benefit that night was for a children's literacy program across rural Alberta, a good cause that nobody in the room had spent more than 4 minutes thinking about, and the literacy program would receive a respectable check and a photograph for its newsletter, and the people who came would receive what they had actually come for, which was the chance to be seen among the right people on the right night. The waitstaff moved between them in quiet, careful orbits, trained to be present and invisible at the same time, trained to read in half a second which guest wanted attention and which wanted only to be left to glow. And somewhere underneath the wood smoke and the orchids and the warm yellow light of an evening arranged entirely for appearances, a contract worth $1.2 billion waited for a single name to be written at the bottom of it. Naomi Adeyemi did not arrive the way people in that room expected billionaires to arrive. She came up the drive in a black sedan she had not bothered to make impressive, and she stepped out into the cold in a charcoal silk dress that was beautifully cut and said nothing at all about its price. She wore one thin gold chain and no other jewelry. She had not brought an assistant or a date or a publicist. She was 46 years old, and if you had passed her on a sidewalk in Toronto, you might have noticed the unhurried way she carried herself and nothing more. Because she had spent a lifetime learning that the most useful thing a person can be, in a room full of people deciding what you are, is quietly underestimated. She had grown up in Scarborough, in a third-floor apartment with a radiator that knocked all winter, the daughter of a nurse who had come from Lagos with 2 suitcases and a man who drove a TTC bus for 31 years and never once missed a shift. They had not been poor in the way that makes a good story later. They had been poor in the ordinary, grinding way, the way where you learn early to calculate whether the bus fare and the groceries can both fit in the same week. Naomi had been 23 and working nights when she borrowed $25,000 from a credit union in Agincourt and built the first crude version of what would, 2 decades later, become Cardinal Grid Systems, a company that designed the software running clean energy power grids across 4 continents and was now valued at just under $28 billion. She had not inherited a cent of it. She had not married into it. She had failed in ways that would have ended most people, and then she had built it back, later than everyone else, still in the building most nights, and earlier than them in the morning, not because she wanted to be admired for the effort, but because the work simply needed doing, and she was the one doing it. She kept no publicist. She turned down nearly every interview. She had funded a scholarship for the past 11 years that had quietly put more than 400 girls from low-income neighborhoods through university, and not one of them had ever been told who paid for it, because she remembered being the girl who chose textbooks over a winter coat, and she did not want gratitude. She wanted the next one to not have to choose. Her board found this admirable. Her lawyers occasionally found it maddening. She found it simply correct, and she had stopped explaining it years ago. She had agreed to come to the Glenmara because the deal that was meant to be finalized in the morning had a human side to it, and Naomi believed, with the stubbornness of a woman who had learned it the hard way, that how a person behaved when they thought it didn't matter told you more than any audited statement ever could. Cardinal Grid was acquiring Caldwell Resources, a legacy Alberta mining and energy company that had been in the same family for 3 generations and was now, beneath its paneled boardrooms and its proud old name, drowning quietly in debt. The acquisition would fold Caldwell's aging infrastructure into Cardinal's grid network and keep 2,000 people employed who would otherwise have been laid off by spring. The host had offered the benefit as a graceful, neutral place for both sides to share an evening before the papers were signed. Naomi had said yes. She had no idea, walking through the heavy oak doors at 20 to 8, that she was about to learn everything she needed to know. She stepped inside and felt the room assess her and dismiss her in the same motion. A woman at the coat check smiled the polite, brief smile that means nothing. A pair of men near the bar tracked her without turning their heads. A server offered her a glass of champagne, and she took it and held it without drinking. And she moved through the warmth and the noise the way she always did, watching everything while almost no one watched her, waiting, as she had waited her whole life, for the room to catch up. The Caldwells had owned a corner of Alberta society for 3 generations, which in their own minds meant something permanent, something that could not be bought by anyone who had not been born into it. Gordon Caldwell was 62, and he had taken over Caldwell Resources from his father at 39 and run it competently and unremarkably ever since, riding the long good years of the oil sands and keeping the company afloat on conservative instincts and the kind of relationships that come from 30 years of sitting on the right boards and writing checks to the right charities. He was not a builder, he was a caretaker, and for a long time the world had told him that caretaking was a kind of excellence, and he had believed it with the comfortable certainty of a man who has never once had to defend a belief in order to keep it. But the last 4 years had been unkind. 2 contracts had not been renewed. An expansion had eaten capital that should have stayed in reserve. The debt had grown first quietly and then loudly, and the Cardinal acquisition was no longer just a good opportunity. It was the difference between the Caldwell family keeping their name on the building and watching it stripped off in a fire sale. Gordon knew this. His lawyers knew it. His chief financial officer had told him in plain words. And none of that knowledge had changed, even slightly, the way Gordon Caldwell moved through a room or weighed the people in it, because to Gordon the crisis was a financial problem, and financial problems could be solved, and everything else, the certainty, the standing, the unspoken sense of where he sat in the order of things, remained exactly where it had always been. His wife understood the danger even less. Vanessa Caldwell was 57 and had been the social engine of the family for as long as anyone in the province could remember. She sat on the boards of 2 galleries and a symphony. She had chaired this very benefit 4 times. She knew which families had old money and which had money best left undiscussed, and she dispensed her warmth accordingly, the way a queen hands out favor, as a signal rather than a kindness. She prided herself on reading a room within a minute of entering it, and she had been right often enough over 30 years that the rare misses had never gathered into a pattern she needed to examine. She did not think of herself as a snob. She thought of herself as discerning, and the difference to her was real and important. To the woman in the charcoal dress now moving toward the reserved tables at the front, it was neither. Vanessa noticed her the way she noticed everything that was slightly out of place. The front tables were not open seating. There was a separate list, and Vanessa had helped build it herself, and the woman drifting toward them did not match any face she could place. Which meant, in the quick arithmetic, Vanessa ran without quite knowing she was running it, that either a mistake had been made or someone had walked in where she did not belong. She set down her glass with the small, deliberate precision of a woman accustomed to being right, and she crossed the floor to intercept. Naomi had nearly reached the table when the older woman stepped into her path. It was not a violent thing, just a body placed between one point and another, a planted presence. Naomi stopped. She looked at the woman without alarm and without apology, and she waited. "May I see your invitation?" Vanessa asked. The words were polite in shape. The tone was not. It carried a conclusion already reached. Naomi opened the small clutch she carried and produced the cream-colored card. Vanessa took it, glanced at it, and handed it back without acknowledgement. "These tables are reserved," she said. "It isn't about the card. It's about whether you're on the list." Naomi said, evenly, that her name was on the primary list, that she had confirmed her seat 2 weeks earlier, and that the event coordinator could clear it up in under a minute if there was any question. She did not raise her voice. She did not soften it either. Vanessa's expression did not change. She asked the woman to step aside while she checked. Naomi said she was happy to wait, but saw no reason to step away from a table she'd been assigned to, and something in that. The calm refusal to perform the small retreat she'd been ordered to perform, the steady eye contact that did not flinch, moved through Vanessa like a draft under a door. The conversation tightened the way these things do, when one person has decided how it ends, and the other quietly declines to cooperate. Vanessa's voice did not climb, but it sharpened. She gestured toward the entrance and said that guests with concerns about seating should take them up with staff. Naomi said, without heat, that she wasn't a guest with a concern. She was a guest with a seat. And then Vanessa reached out and took hold of her forearm. Not hard, at first, the grip of a woman who expects the touch itself to finish what her words had not. Naomi looked down at the hand on her arm, and then back up. "Please let go of me," she said. Her voice did not tremble. It was not a question. What happened next was seen clearly by perhaps 40 people and caught on the phones of at least 6. Vanessa let go of the arm, and then, in a motion that seemed to come from somewhere older and deeper than the moment, from some reservoir of offended certainty she had carried for 57 years, she brought her open hand across the younger woman's cheek. The sound of it stopped the room. Every head within 30 feet turned. Nobody moved. Afterward, none of the people standing nearest would be able to fully explain why they had done nothing, except to say they were stunned, and that by the time the stun wore off, something had already shifted that made stepping in feel pointless, almost rude. Naomi stood completely still. She touched her cheek with 2 fingers. Not the way you touch a wound, but the way you confirm a fact. Her face did not break. There was no flash of anger, and no visible hurt, and that stillness unsettled the witnesses more than any reaction would have, because it suggested a woman who had not been knocked off balance at all, who had simply taken the blow and set it down somewhere precise, inside herself, where it would be used rather than wasted. Vanessa, for her part, seemed to expect something back, a flinch, a retreat, some sound of acknowledgement that order had been restored. When none came, she smoothed the front of her gown and turned slightly away, as if the matter were settled. Her husband appeared at her elbow, a moment later, having steered toward the disturbance from across the room. He listened to her short account with his head bowed, and he said, quietly, but loud enough for 2 or 3 people nearby to hear, that she had likely handled it correctly, that someone had to maintain a standard. Naomi heard him. She gave no sign that she had. Then, from a few feet away, a voice said, "That's enough." It was a server, a young woman, maybe 22, in the black vest of the catering company, holding a tray of empty glasses. Her name was Devon, and she would later say she had no idea where the words came from, only that she could not stand there and hold a tray while it happened. "You hit her," Devon said, and her voice shook, but she did not stop. "I saw you hit her." We all did. A few feet beyond her, an older guest in a gray shawl, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Okonkwo, who had come as someone's plus one and known no one all night, set down her plate and said, plainly, to no one and everyone, someone should call the police. Nobody had said the word out loud yet. Now it was in the room. Naomi looked at the young server for a moment, and something in her face eased, very slightly, the way it does when you find one decent person in a room that has disappointed you. Then she reached into her clutch and took out her phone. She did not look around for sympathy. She did not search the crowd for someone to confirm what they'd all just watched. She made a call. It lasted perhaps 40 seconds, and the only words anyone close enough could make out were the last ones. "Stop the signing. Pull it." She ended the call, put the phone away, walked to her assigned seat, sat down, and picked up the menu card as though deciding what she might have for dinner. 3 floors above the ballroom, in a suite Cardinal Grid's legal team had taken for the weekend. The call was answered by Naomi's general counsel, a man named Priscilla. No, by a man who had worked beside her for 9 years and who understood, from the brevity of it and the flatness of her voice, that the decision had already been made and was not the opening of a negotiation. He did not ask why. He did not suggest she sleep on it. He had known her long enough to tell the difference between her voice when she was weighing something and her voice when the weighing was done. He made 2 calls inside of 5 minutes. The first went to the lead lawyer handling the acquisition documents. The second went to the senior partner at the fund backing the deal. Both calls were short. Both ended the same way. The term sheet was suspended. The 9 o'clock signing was canceled. Everyone was to be notified before the night was out. The deal had survived 11 months of negotiation, 3 rounds of due diligence, a regulatory review, and the patient, unglamorous work of more than 40 people across 4 firms. Until 90 minutes ago, it had been the most certain thing on every one of their calendars. Now it was gone. Not paused for reconsideration, gone. The Caldwells did not know yet. Gordon was at the bar with 2 men from a Calgary bank, talking about the morning's schedule with the mild pleasure of a man who believes the hard part is behind him. Vanessa had rejoined a cluster of women near the fireplace and was describing the incident to them in the satisfied tone of someone who had just dealt with a small administrative nuisance. Their son, Spencer Caldwell 30, and listed on the company website as a vice president of something, was on the terrace in a conversation that had nothing to do with the firm. For the better part of an hour, the family moved through the evening with the ease of people who have never once had reason to doubt that the room belonged to them. The first sign that something had changed came from the wrong direction. A man named Harlan Voss, who sat on the finance committee of the consortium backing the purchase, stepped away from a conversation near the back wall after his phone lit up. His face, which had been pleasant and social all night, did something that the people around him noticed without understanding. He excused himself and moved quickly through the crowd to the bar, and he touched Gordon Caldwell's elbow, and he leaned in, and he said 3 words Gordon would replay in his head for the rest of his life. "The deal's dead." Gordon laughed first, the short, reflexive laugh of a man who is sure he's misheard. Then he looked at Voss's face and stopped. He asked what he meant. Voss told him the acquisition had been formally suspended 11 minutes ago, that the morning signing was canceled, and that the order had come from the buyer's chief executive directly, by phone, from inside this building, during this benefit, within the last half hour. Gordon set down his glass. He asked who the buyer's chief executive was. Voss looked at him for a long moment, and then he said the name. Naomi Adeyemi. It arrived in Gordon slowly, the way the full weight of a collision arrives after the noise of it has already faded. He had been told, in the months of preparation, that the final approval rested with the buyer's CEO. He had seen the name on documents. He had built an image of that person in his mind, assembled from the deal's size and the way her people spoke and the firm's reputation, and the image had a certain shape to it, a certain configuration of authority and presence. And the woman in the charcoal dress, standing alone in the doorway an hour ago, had not matched it. Not because she had disguised anything, because his imagination had built its picture out of assumption rather than evidence. And that was the most honest and most devastating thing the evening had to show him, slowly turning over in his chest as he stood at the bar. Not that his wife had made a mistake, but that he had made it first, completely and silently, before she ever crossed the floor. He turned and looked toward the front tables. He could see her from where he stood, seated, upright, perfectly composed, reading something on her phone with the unbothered patience of a woman who has nowhere better to be and nothing left to prove. Across the room, a board member from the consortium recognized her too. He went very still, and he turned to the colleague beside him, and he said, in a voice with all the ease drained out of it, "Do you know who that is?" The colleague looked. They both looked. And then the colleague walked straight over to where Voss stood with Gordon, and the circle of people who understood widened by 2, and then by 4, and then it kept widening across the ballroom like a stain spreading through cloth. Vanessa was summoned from her fireside conversation. She came to her husband's side with the air of a woman expecting to be handed something manageable. What she was told instead took her several full seconds to process. Not because it was complicated, but because accepting it required dismantling a certainty she had carried since the instant she stepped into the younger woman's path. She had assumed the woman didn't belong. She had assumed she was in the wrong place. She had assumed, from something she would never have said out loud, that the woman in the charcoal dress was less than the room she had walked into, that her presence needed explaining, and her comfort did not need considering. And she had been wrong, not just about one person's name, but about the whole apparatus she used to sort the world. The first thing to reach her face was not regret. It was a draining of color, a whitening that came not from understanding but from fear. Gordon crossed the ballroom toward the front tables with the desperate, purposeful stride of a man hurrying toward a consequence he already knows he cannot outrun. In the 30 seconds it took him to get there, he had assembled something in his head, a sequence of phrases meant to sound humble while quietly leaving the door open, in case some adequate apology might still pull the thing back from the edge. He reached her table and stood at its edge and cleared his throat. He said her name with the full weight of its professional significance, as if pronouncing it correctly now might make up for not having known it an hour ago. He said he needed to apologize. He said there had been a terrible misunderstanding. He said his wife had been operating without the proper information, and the apology came out in a shape that almost worked, but didn't, because folded inside it was a frame that gave the whole thing away. The suggestion that the problem had been one of mistaken identity rather than of behavior, that if only the right information had been available, the evening would have gone differently. It was the apology of a man sorry for the outcome and not for the act, sorry that the woman had turned out to matter, rather than sorry that she'd been treated as though she did not. Naomi looked at him without expression. She did not stand. She did not invite him to sit. She let the words arrive and settle, and then she spoke quietly, in a voice that was not unkind and left no room at all. She said she understood what he was trying to say, and that she didn't doubt he believed it. She said the slap itself, serious as it was, and as much as it would now be handled through the proper channels, was not actually the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter, she said, was that his wife had treated a stranger, a person whose name and standing she had no idea of, first with contempt and then with violence. That the behavior had not come from a mistake about who Naomi was. It had come from a decision about what kind of person deserves to be treated like a human being. And if that was the character of the people running the company, she could not in good conscience build anything on top of it, because foundations don't reveal themselves in boardrooms. They reveal themselves in the moments when nobody important seems to be watching. Vanessa had followed her husband across the floor and stood a few feet behind him, listening. She tried once to insert a correction, a sentence that began with the words, "What you have to understand." And Naomi looked at her, briefly, and turned her attention back to Gordon. Around them, the ring of people pretending not to listen had stopped pretending. The trio by the windows was playing something soft and low, but the music had lost its power to cover anything. Naomi finished with one sentence, delivered not for the room, but for Gordon alone, in the tone of a person stating a policy already in effect. "If this is how your family treats a stranger," she said, "I can't hand it a billion-dollar partnership." Then she looked back down at the menu card, and the conversation was over. It did not end there for Vanessa Caldwell. Devon, the young server, had already told the lodge's duty manager what she'd seen, and the manager, who had no interest in his employer's name, appearing in a story about an assault at a charity gala, had already called the detachment. 2 RCMP officers arrived a little after 10, stamping snow from their boots in the front hall, and the senior of the two, a calm woman named Constable Tremblay, spoke first to Devon, then to Mrs. Okonkwo in the gray shawl, then to 2 other guests who had filmed it, and finally, in a quiet side room off the lobby, to Naomi herself. Naomi did not perform outrage for the constable. She answered the questions plainly, confirmed she wished to proceed, and provided the contact information for her lawyer. She had thought about it in the 40 minutes between the slap and the officer's arrival, and she had decided that letting it go would have been a kindness to no one but the woman who had done it. She had spent her whole life watching people learn that the rules applied to them only when someone with standing insisted, and she was, that night, someone with standing. Vanessa Caldwell was charged with assault before midnight. She was not handcuffed and led out. It was not that kind of evening. But she was issued a court date, and the difference between this is the version of the story, Rizzer, where a wealthy woman strikes a stranger and simply drives home, was not lost on anyone who heard about it afterward, and a great many people heard about it. By the next afternoon, the story had moved through the private channels of enough people in Calgary and Toronto that it had the texture of something already known rather than newly discovered, a thing people referenced with the confidence of those who had been present even when they had only been told. One of the phone videos circulated in a limited, careful way. None of it was pushed by Naomi or anyone connected to her. It simply moved the way true things move through small, concentrated circles, not because anyone forced it, but because it had the weight of something too solid to be softened into rumor. The consequences for Caldwell Resources came in the order such things always come. The fund withdrew its financing. The bank revisited its position. By Monday morning, 2 business reporters who covered the energy sector had the story, and the company's communications team, caught without a plan for a situation no crisis manual had imagined, put out a statement calling the evening a private misunderstanding between individuals and affirming the firm's commitment to strong partnerships. The statement did not use the word slap. It did not name Naomi. It did not work. Within 36 hours, 2 institutional shareholders were asking questions whose meaning was clear even through the polite language. The share price, already soft, dropped to a level that triggered automatic reviews. The board convened an emergency call, and by the accounts of the 2 people, willing to describe it later, the tone of that call was unlike anything the company had heard in a decade. Gordon Caldwell spent the 72 hours after the benefit in something close to grief, not for the deal, though the loss of it was severe, but for the version of himself and his family the night had quietly retired. He had believed, without ever quite saying it, that the Caldwells' standing was the product of merit as much as inheritance, that they had earned their place through the quality of their conduct. He had sat in rooms for 30 years and heard his family called pillars, examples, the sort of institution a province builds itself around, and he had received those words the way you receive any pleasant thing you've never had reason to question. The Gala had not just cost him a contract. It had cost him a story he had told himself for 62 years, and it had done so in front of a room full of people who had heard that same story and were now, quietly and permanently, revising it. Vanessa did not speak publicly. Those who knew her said the silence was not peace. She had built an entire identity on the certainty of her own judgment, on the belief that her read of a person was accurate and appropriate, and that certainty had collapsed in a single evening in a way no private recalibration could repair. She pleaded guilty in the spring to a reduced charge, paid a fine, and was ordered to complete a number of hours of community service, and the photograph of her leaving the small courthouse in Canmore, coat pulled up against the cold, did more to settle the matter in the public mind than any of it. She was, by every account, not a woman incapable of reflection. But reflection asks you to look squarely at the thing you did rather than at the circumstances that led to it, and that willingness comes on its own schedule, in its own time, and sometimes not at all. Naomi spoke about the evening exactly once to her senior team 10 days later. She did not dramatize it. She did not call it a victory, or turn it into a statement about anything larger, though the larger thing was real, and she was well aware of it, because the audience for that conversation was not her leadership team. It was herself, and she had already had it, privately, in the hour after the gala, driving back down the dark highway from Banff, with her phone face down on the passenger seat, finally letting herself feel everything she had not let herself feel in the ballroom. She told her team only that the evaluation of a partner is never just the financial documentation. That character shows itself when no one important seems to be watching, and that the decision to walk away had been consistent with the standard she expected of every partnership the company entered. She thanked them for 11 months of work, acknowledged that the result was disappointing, and asked them to bring her the next candidate. Then she moved to the next item on the agenda, and the meeting went on. A few months after that, Cardinal Grid completed a different acquisition in the same sector. A smaller firm, with less of a name but more integrity, whose leaders Naomi had met 3 times in person and found to be people who treated the staff in the hallway the same way they treated the room in the boardroom. The deal closed without ceremony. There was no gala and no chandelier. There was a meeting room on the 4th floor of an unremarkable building in Calgary, a signed stack of papers, a brief round of handshakes, and then everyone went back to work. The 2,000 jobs that the Caldwell deal would have protected were largely absorbed into the new arrangement anyway, which was a thing Naomi had made certain of, quietly, because the people on the floor of those plants had never done anything but their jobs, and they should not lose them over a thing that happened in a ballroom they would never have been allowed inside. There was a last meeting, 8 months on, arranged through mutual contacts at a neutral law office in downtown Calgary. Gordon Caldwell had asked for it. He wanted, he said through the intermediary, only to speak with her directly. No lawyers, no agenda, no expectation of any business outcome. Naomi agreed, because she believed in closure and did not believe in carrying unfinished things around in her attention where they took up room she could use for better purposes. They sat across a small table. There was water. There was no one else. Gordon said he had spent 8 months trying to understand what had happened, not only that night, but in the years and the habits of thought that had made it possible for his wife to do what she did and for him to defend it, even for a moment. He said he wished they had met some other way. He said it plainly, without performance, and it was the most honest thing she had ever heard from him. Naomi looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "We did meet correctly. Your family just showed me the truth a little faster than most." She said it without malice and without satisfaction, the way a person states something they have thought about carefully and arrived at honestly. Gordon nodded. He did not argue. They sat for a while, in the particular quiet of people who have said everything that needed saying, and then she stood, and she put out her hand, and he shook it, and she collected her folder and walked out through the corridor and into the elevator and out into the bright cold of a Calgary afternoon, where the city went on around her in its ordinary, indifferent way, full of the next thing. She did not celebrate what had happened to the Caldwells. She took no pleasure in their reduced circumstances, because reducing them had never been the point. The point had been to protect something she had built over 23 years. From people who had not understood that power is not the same as character, that money is not the same as decency, that the confidence to slap a stranger in a room full of witnesses is not strength, but its exact opposite. She had not needed to bring the family down. She had only needed to step back and let the thing they had built bear a weight it was never strong enough to carry. The slap had lasted half a second. She had felt all of it, the sting, the indignity, the particular loneliness of being harmed in plain sight while a room full of people arranged themselves around their own discomfort instead of hers. And she had held it, and she had turned it, with care, into a decision placed at the precise moment its weight would land hardest. She had not spent it on anger. She had not spent it on a scene. She had understood, with the clarity that comes from a lifetime of being underestimated, that the most powerful thing she could do was to remain exactly who she was and let the room discover, in its own time, what that meant. She walked back toward her hotel that afternoon, and she had a meeting at 8 the next morning that she was looking forward to. And there were things to build, the way there had always been things to build. And the woman who had been struck across the face in front of 200 witnesses was the same woman who had turned 25,000 borrowed dollars into a company worth $28 billion, which meant she already knew everything she would ever need to know about how things begin, and what they can become, and exactly who gets to decide.